God is telling us to care for our neighbor. We've all lived long enough in the world, haven't we, to know that people plan evil against one another. So if we're going to follow Christ, maybe, if you grew up in one of those generations or are, then you need to find out how to follow Christ. And that the Bible calls that love. Since the book of Proverbs is about the many real-life ways that God's commandments impact daily life, we can find many examples of what loving one's neighbor looks like. Now, we often think, though, of loving and honoring that commandment in the positive, in the sense of things we do for our neighbor, and that's certainly in Proverbs. It's certainly something we should do. And we're taught that in other places in the Bible. But one thing we will see in the book of Proverbs, we started seeing it last week, and I wanted to remind you of it again this week, is that when we consider fulfilling the commandment to love our neighbor in the book of Proverbs, we see what oftentimes is described in the negative. We are told that if we love our neighbor, we do not do some things. The commandments themselves, the 10 commandments, are given in the negative. You shall not, you shall not, you shall not, you shall not. And so we see this pattern very clearly in the book of Proverbs as well. Now, I want you to keep in the back of your mind, as we study through Proverbs on this subject of loving your neighbor, that what Proverbs is doing is it takes for granted that we are doing Deuteronomy chapter 6. And that is that we are hiding the commandments of God in our heart. We are putting them on our doorposts. We're discussing them in our dwellings. We're talking about them with our children. We're filling our lives with the covenant commandments of God. And so then Proverbs comes along and shows us, okay, well, how do I know the commandment of God that I should love my neighbor, or that I should not bear false witness against my neighbor, or covet his horse or his home or his wife or any of these things. Those are fairly practical. But then there are a myriad of other ways that we're going to bump into our neighbors. We looked last week as to who are our neighbors, so you can go back and look on that. But we're going to bump into our neighbors, and we need to honor the commandments of God toward our neighbor. And that the Bible calls that love. You see, the Bible calls love when we obey the commandments of God. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. There's always in the Bible this place that when we love, that's an action word. It's not just a feeling word. Now, oftentimes it is accompanied with feeling. But to show you that my point is correct, how many of you have the warm fuzzies when you love your enemy? Anybody? When someone who hates you, maybe without a cause, and you in turn seek to obey the commandments of God, so you love them in turn. Do you feel like loving them? No, you don't. But it is love when we give them kindness and forgiveness and prayer and these kinds of things, when that has been returned with hatred or violence or slander. And so we see that love in the Scriptures is about obeying God. Now, oftentimes that is accompanied with feelings, but not always. So last time we talked about that. So we're talking about loving our neighbor, which in the Proverbs oftentimes means not doing some things. The first one we looked at last time in our introduction part. We love our neighbor when we do not look down on him. And in many ways, this is where it starts. It's right up here. We love our neighbor when we don't look down on him. And that's where it has to start, doesn't it? If we don't put our neighbor on the same level as ourselves, then we're already not loving them. We're dehumanizing them in a sense. So the fact that they are created in the image of God, just like you and I, and that God commands us to love them. We also talked about how, at one point, we might be the down and out, and they are the ones on the up. So, if we get that haughty attitude, we could find ourselves in a worse condition at some point. God tells us in Proverbs, we looked at that in some passages last week on that, we love our neighbor when we don't look down on him. And when we see our neighbor as a valuable person just like ourselves, we don't have the snobbish view of them or the pity view. Okay? You know what I'm talking about? There's a sense in which we can put ourselves on a pedestal, help the less fortunate by looking down our nose at them. And we know that is something oftentimes that the elite in our culture do. They are much about their programs and things that they supposedly care for the poor, while they live in luxury and gated communities and all these kinds of things. So it's not really love. It's kind of pity. But number two, here's the one we're going to look at tonight. We love our neighbor when we do not look to fight with him, or we do not look to fight him. So there is this way, once again, that we need to view our neighbor properly. And let's look at a couple of things there that bears this out. Of course, the text we read in just a few moments ago, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come again. Tomorrow I will give it when you have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. What is this describing in chapter 3? It's describing someone who has a desire to harm or at least not do good to their neighbor. That's what he's saying here. He says, if it's within your power to give to your neighbor, don't withhold it. Now that could be help, it could be honor. Because we know that the Bible says, withhold not honor to whom it is due. He says, do not plan evil against your neighbor. We've all lived long enough in the world, haven't we, to know that people plan evil against one another. They do it on small scale, they do it on large scale. I mean, you can get into world politics and all that stuff, but the reality is it goes on in the office, in the workroom, it goes on in the neighborhood, it goes on everywhere. It goes on in families, it goes on in homes. People plot evil oftentimes. So we have some verses here that I'm going to share with you, some passages that I've broken down in 3 ways that describe how we might have an attitude of fighting with our neighbor. See, God is telling us to dwell with our neighbor in peace. God is telling us to care for our neighbor. And so the first thing we see here about that he's warning us not to have a fighting attitude or spirit toward our neighbor. We could look down on our neighbor, or we could look against our neighbor. We could be at odds with people, others. And so the first one that I want to point out is that we should not dislike them. And I'm going to just put him. Without cause. Without cause. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 30, we just read, do not contend or argue or fight with a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. Have you ever met somebody that they're at war with everybody? In fact, the Proverbs in another place says, don't keep company with an angry man, lest you learn his ways. So in other words, we all know this, attitudes are catching. Attitudes move off onto other people, especially anger. So God tells us, don't keep company, don't hang around with people who are angry all the time. You will become an angry person, is what he's saying. Some people just dislike others. They don't like people. It's kind of a running joke with the Generation Z and the millennials to talk about how much they dislike people. Have you seen that? Any of this? It's a joke, but in many ways they're serious. Now, it is not an accident that is those are the first two generations in the history of the world that came out of the womb, and social media, computers, the internet was in existence. Before the millennials, you had the Generation X, which is my generation. Well, that computers didn't come into prominent usage really till, Xers were way up in their teenage years. I had a friend in junior high or middle school, and he had a computer at home. And I remember that I went home from school with him one day, and we played chess, and we played out in the yard and all that. And then he took me into his room and showed me his computer. And I'm sure it was a Mac, or an Apple. That's about all anybody had back then. And he turned it on, and he typed a few things, and that was it. We turned it back off and went back outside to play. So the millennials and the Generation Z are the first ones in the history of the world that grew up talking to people through the internet. They are more used to, oftentimes, to talk to people through the internet than they are with talking with people in person. They're very uncomfortable with that. They don't know how to handle that. Even their dating and their friendships and all of that have this tendency to be very temporary, to be exceedingly shallow. And I'm not trying to pick on them. This is just a sociological observation. And those folks are saying, I don't like people. I like, my small group, or I like my dog, or my cat, or whatever, more than I like people. Well, that's not right, quite honestly. God didn't give us the freedom to say, as Christians, I don't like people. He never gave us that. He told us, love your neighbor. So if we're going to follow Christ, maybe, if you grew up in one of those generations or are, then you need to find out how to follow Christ. That we're not to dislike our neighbor without a cause. Now, it's assuming in that passage in chapter 3, verse 30, that the person has done nothing wrong to you. You don't have a reason to mistreat them or to dislike them. But it also tells us to love our enemies. But in Proverbs, it's assuming that this person has done you no wrong. In chapter 21, verse 10. 21, verse 10. Here's another one. The soul of the wicked desires evil. His neighbor finds no mercy in his eyes. This is those who do not keep God's commandments. That's what it means to be wicked. All right? The soul of the wicked desires evil, and his neighbor finds no mercy in his eyes. So there is no compassion, no mercy in the eyes of a ungodly person. And this is one of the things that we find out in the pastoral epistles when the last days are described. That we find out that the more people become ungodly, they're called merciless, without compassion, with unnatural affection, the King James says. And a lot of times, now the Bible does forbid homosexuality and all of those kinds of things that are aberrant sexuality. One man, one woman for life. That's what God says is okay in His commandments. He created people, He created sex, He created everything else. He also says what's acceptable and what's sin. But we tend to think when we read that in the King James Version, unnatural affection. In that passage, we tend to think that that's referring to sexual sins. But it's not. That passage, when it says unnatural affection in the Authorized Version, it says it's talking about the kind of affection that a mother normally has for a child. But he says in there that in the last days, that will not be the case. That oftentimes parents, mothers, will not love their children like they have throughout the centuries. Well, I don't know. When you say 60 million babies have been aborted, I'd say that's a fulfillment of that prediction, wouldn't you? And notice this, in our current culture, this is very recent. If you will notice the prevalence of making fun of children today. Maybe you haven't noticed this. If you haven't, just take what I'm saying, just tuck it right back in your heart and mind. And now as you're watching television or movies, as you see things online, as you read magazines and so forth, just pay attention to it. It's disturbing. It's very disturbing that we would make fun, adults make fun of children in the way that our culture is beginning to do this. It's dangerous. Disliking our neighbor without a cause. God tells us that we shouldn't do that. If we're going to obey God, then we need to love Him, actively pursue caring about others. Look at our culture around us. It's losing that. We can't figure out the crime rates are crawling up and all this kind of stuff. Why? America is abandoning the commandments of God. It's abandoning the Christian virtue. Some churches are. Proverbs 29:5, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. Now what this is talking about in 29:5, chapter 29, verse 5, is a neighbor, a person in your community. Doesn't necessarily mean your next door neighbor, but someone in your realm, a wicked person who does not honor the commandments of God, uses flattery to set a trap for someone else. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen this. Maybe it's even been done to you. That someone, maybe somebody at work, knows that you might get a promotion. And they would rather have that promotion. So they flatter you to your face and slander you to the authority figures. So you let your guard down because you think you got a friend. But at the same time, he sets a net, a trap for you. Flattery. Flattery's bait. Flattery is to get us to lower our standards. In other words, if we love our neighbor, we don't we don't dislike them in this way. We don't flatter them. Oftentimes when you flatter somebody, your opinion of them, tell me if I'm right, your opinion of them is the opposite. You see, flattery really is a lie. Now, a compliment is something you believe. This person is good at something or whatever. It is an accurate compliment. Flattery is to set a net. It is a trap against our neighbor. And why? Because for whatever reason, we dislike them. And he says here, without a cause. Secondly, we see that we do not plot against him in competition. Plot against him in competition. Very similar, but not exactly the same. Proverbs 3:29, do not plan or plot evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. Our neighbor, whether it be our believing neighbor, whether it be our spouse, whether it be our enemy, whether it be someone who needs help, we should not, while they think they can trust us, we seize the opportunity to harm them or plot to use them in some way. Oftentimes, the needs of the poor are used for political gain, aren't they? You think that's done out of care or concern? No. Oftentimes it's done so that that sympathy can be marshaled for whatever a politician or somebody might want. We need to be careful not to be that kind of person. That's Proverbs 3:29. Do not plan evil against your neighbor. Proverbs 14:22. Do they not go astray who devise evil or plot evil, plan evil? Those who devise good meet steadfast love and faithfulness. So he's saying we all have plans, but what are our... It's not that it's wrong to have a plan. It's wrong to devise evil. It's wrong to plan evil. But those that plan good, he says, will enjoy steadfast love and faithfulness. In other words, others will appreciate them. God will bless them. This includes revenge. Proverbs 24, verses 28 through 29. Be not a witness against your neighbor without a cause, and do not deceive with your lips. Do not say, here it is, do not say, I will do to him as he has done to me. I will pay the man back for what he has done. That's revenge. And he says that we should not do that. Maybe, now up here it says without a cause. But you know, if you've lived long enough, somebody has plotted and hurt you in some way, shape, or form. But one way I love my neighbor, in this case it would be kind of an enemy, wouldn't it? Is that I don't return the favor. I don't plot to get even. You know, some people say, was it something I get, what's that saying? I don't get over it, I get even, or something. Is that, did I have that right? I don't get mad, I get even. Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, if you get even, guess what? You already got mad. So, as one who wants to please God with our life and obey God's commandments and to bring glory to Christ, then even if we have been done wrong, we don't return the favor. We don't plot to get revenge, as he says here in Proverbs. He says, do not say, do not plan, we might say, or do not say, I will do to him as he has done to me. That's revenge. This includes slander and lying about others. Proverbs 11:9, with his mouth the godless man would destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered. You see, this is oftentimes the case with believers in Christ and with God and believers in God, that the lost will persecute them through slander. That Christians were blamed for the fall of Rome. Christians were called cannibals in the early church. You say, well, why? Well, because Christians drank and ate the Lord's Supper, and Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood." So the Romans went around saying Christians were cannibals. They drank blood and ate meat. This is the kind of slander is an attack with words. It's lies marshaled to hurt another person. With his mouth, the godless man will destroy his neighbor. They said about our Lord Jesus, he is gluttonous and a wine bibber. Remember that? And they said John the Baptist had a demon. This is the way this works over and over. The Puritans were called, the people that divided. And we're in a case now where America has been predominantly Protestant most of its existence. So for most of America's existence, these people were heroes, the Pilgrims. Now they're villains. Did you know that? Yep. Why? Because the lost are slandering their testimony. Because the lost is slandering anybody that trusts and believes in the commandments of God. This is the way but it happens in the church too. Many times we don't love our neighbor in the church because we tell lies on them. One of my pastors used to tell the story. He and his, I think it wasn't his dad. It was a man he worked for. They were carpenters. And he said that they lived in a little small town. At the same time, he was pastoring, but he was working also as a carpenter. And so he said one morning we got a call that there had been a fight at one of the local bars. He said, and in the fight, they broke the front door down. So they were called to come and tear down the broken door and install a new door. He said, so, we go over, we take that out, we put the new door in, get everything set up and everything. He said it would have been very easy for a church member to drive down the road and see me coming out of a bar, when in reality, I had just fixed a door. I wasn't in there drinking or this kind of thing. So we have to be careful. We're dealing with people's testimonies. We're dealing with people's lives. So we don't just haphazardly make charges about people like that. Proverbs 11:13, whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. Many times people slander or gossip. They do these things because they want others to think they are a reliable source. When the Bible is telling us that if a slanderer or someone who goes about revealing secrets is actually not a trustworthy person. You see how God clarifies things for us? Truth is, if they'll say those things about somebody else to you, they may say those things about you to somebody else. You see, we have to be careful about these kinds of things. Guard our hearts. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy is in spirit keeps a thing covered. It's what we just said, isn't it? We protect a person's testimony as much as we possibly can. Not saying you cover up a bunch of sins, but the Bible does say this: love covers a multitude of sins. I didn't say that, God did. So in other words, there's not this dislike, there's not this plot to hurt someone. There is a desire to help them. So, and then lastly and quickly, we do not lie about them. We do not lie about them. This is another slight nuance. We don't lie about him in court. Now, we just talked about slander and plotting, but these passages are particularly referring to court situations. In fact, the Ten Commandments is saying that. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor is technically you're lying against your neighbor in a court situation where the person is being charged with breaking the commandments of God or breaking the laws of Israel, and you are lying, that person really did not do that. That's what God is forbidding primarily in the commandment. And he furthermore explains that in Proverbs 25, verses the second part of verse 7. I don't know why they split the verse, down to verse 10. He says, what your eyes have seen, do not hastily bring into court. For what will you do in the end when your neighbor puts you to shame? Argue your cause or your case with your neighbor, himself, and do not reveal another's secret, lest he who hears you bring shame upon you and your ill repute have no end. In other words, he's saying, go to your neighbor, work it out together. Don't take everything to court. Don't go to court and lie against another person to get your way. Go to the person, respect the person, care about the person, and be willing to work it out with them. And why? Because he's saying, you may just take that fellow to court and he pulls out evidence that makes you look like the bad guy. And he says, and your shame may not go away. You may carry that shame with you to the end of your days. Proverbs 25:18, a man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a war club or a sword or a sharp arrow. In other words, he's making war on his neighbor by accusing him falsely. He's trying to use authorities to do his dirty work for him. In other words, this person wants to hurt his neighbor, but maybe he's a coward. So he trumps up a bunch of charges, and then he tries to use the authority figures to wage war against their neighbor for them. That's wrong. That's a wrong thing. Proverbs 14:25, a truthful witness saves lives. Tell the truth and you save lives. I mean, how many people have maybe gone to jail or whatever because they've, told a lie. Somebody told a lie on them. But one who breathes out lies is deceitful. Proverbs 24:28-29. Be not a witness against your neighbor without a cause, and do not deceive with your lips. Do not say, I will do to him as he has done to me. I will pay the man back for what he has done. So as he says here in Proverbs, the one way we show love to our neighbor is by not doing some things. We don't look to be at war with others. We don't have a chip on our shoulder. We're not mad. We're not unforgiving, unloving. We don't dislike people without a cause. We work on loving people. We don't plot against people just so we can beat them. Dog eat dog, climbing the ladder, overcoming them, getting the credit. All these kinds of things. That's evil for a Christian to do. This is evil for anybody. But we ought to know better. And then lastly, we don't lie about them in court. We tell the truth. We don't do this to people. We don't use authority figures to hurt those that are at odds with us.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to our latest video. Go ahead and click that little thumb so you can like that video, as well as on the bottom right hand corner, click that little bell to subscribe and receive notifications. Thank you again so much for tuning in, supporting our video ministry here at Cognitive Church.